the Black Bull of Norway. In Norway, Langshan, there lived a certain lady, and she had 3 daughters. The oldest of them said to her mither, "Mither, bake me a bannock, and roast me a collop, for I'm going away to see my fortune." Her mither did say, and the doctor gaed away to an old witch washerwife, and telled her purpose. The old wife bade her stay that day, and gang and look out her back door, and see what she could see. She saw nocht the first day. The second day she did the same, and saw nocht. On the third day she looked again, and saw a coach and 6 coming along the road. She ran in and telled the old wife what she saw. "Aweel," quo the old wife, "yon's for you." Say they took her into the coach and galloped aff. The second doctor says to her mither, "Mither, bake me a bannock, and roast me a collop, for I'm gone away to seek me fortune." Her mither did say, and awa she gaed to the old wife as her sister had done. On the third day she looked out the back door, and saw a coach and 4 coming along the road. "Aweel," quo the old wife, "yon's for you." Say they took her in, and aff they set. The third doctor says to her mither, "Mither, bake me a bannock, and roast me a collop, for I'm gone awa to see me fortune." Her mither did say, and awa she gaed to the old witch wife. She bade her look out her back door, and see what she could see. She did say, and when she came back, said she saw nocht. The second day she did the same, and saw nocht. The third day she looked again, and on coming back said to her old wife she saw nocht but a muckle black bull coming roaring alang the road. "Aweel," quo the old wife, "yon's for you." On hearing this, she was next to distracted with grief and terror, but she was lifted up and set on his back, and awa they went. Aye, they travelled, and on they travelled till the lady grew faint with hunger. "Eat out my right lug," says the black bull, "and drink out my left lug, and set by leavings." Say she did as she said, and was wonderfully refreshed. And lang they gaed, and sair they rade, till they came aside of a very big and bonny castle. "Yonder we maun be this night," quo the bull, "for me old brother lives yonder." And presently they were at the place. They lifted her aff his back, and took her in, and sent him away to a park for the night. And in the morning, when they brought the bull hame, they took the lady into a fine shining parlour, and gave her a beautiful apple, telling her no to break it till she was in the greatest strait ever mortal was in the world, and that wide bring her out. Again she was lifted on the bull's back, and after she had ridden far, and farther than I can tell, they came in sight of a far bonnier castle, and far farther awa than the last. Says the bull till her, "Yonder we maun be full night, for me second brother lives yonder." And when they were at the place directly, they lifted her down and took her in, and sent the bull to the field for the night. And in the morning they took the lady into a fine and rich room, and gave her the finest pear she had ever seen, bidding her no to break it till she was in the greatest strait ever mortal could be in, and that wad to get her out. Again she was lifted and set on his back, and awa they went, and alang they gaed, and sair they rade, till they came in sight of the far biggest castle, and far farthest aff they had yet seen. "We maun be yonder the night," says the bull, "for me young brither lives yonder." And they were there directly. They lifted her down, took her in, and sent the bull to the field for the night. In the morning they took her into a room the finest aye, and gaed her a plum, telling her no to break it till she was in the greatest strait mortal could be in, and that wade gaed her out. Presently they brought hame the bull, set the lady on his back, and awa they went. And aye they gaed, and on they rade, till they came to a dark and ugsome glen, where they stopped, and the lady lighted down. Says the bull to her, "Here ye maun stay till I gang and fight the deil. Ye maun seat yourself on that stane, and move neither hand nor foot till I come back, else I'll never find ye again. And if everything round ye turns blue, I hae beaten the devil. But should a things turn red, he'll have conquered me." She set herself down the stane, and by around her turned blue. O'ercome with joy she lifted the ae foot, and crossed it o'er the ither. Sae glad was she that her companion was victorious. The bull returned and sought for, but never could find her. Lang she sat, and aye she grat till she wearied. At last she rase, and gaed awa, she kedna whar till. On she wandered till she came to a great hill of glass, that she tried aye she could to climb, but wasna able. Round the bottom of the hill she gaed, sabing and grieving a passage hour, till at last she came to a smith's house, and the smith promised if she wad serve him 7 years, he wad make her iron shoon wherewith she could climb all the glassy hill. At 7 years' end she got her iron shoon, climb the glassy hill, and chanced to come to the old washerwife's habitation. There she was told of a gallant young knight that had given in some bloody sarks to wash, and whar washed thy sarks was to be his wife. The auld wife had washed till she was tired, and then she set to her dochter, and baith washed, and they better washed, in hope for getting the young knight. But they couldn't bring out a stain. At length they set the stranger damosel to work, and whenever she began, the stains came out pure and clean. But the auld wife made the knight believe it was her dochter had washed the sarks. So the knight and the eldest daughter were to be married, and the stranger damosel was distracted at the thought of it, for she was deeply in love with him. So she bethought her of her apple, and breaking it, found it filled with gold and precious jewellery, the richest she had ever seen. All these, she said to the eldest daughter, I will give you on condition that you put off your marriage for a day, and allow me to go into his room alone at night. So the lady consented, but meanwhile the auld wife had prepared a sleeping drink, and given it to the knight, who drank it and never wakened till next morning. The lielong night that damosel sobbed and sang, 7 lang years I served for thee, the glassy hill I clamb for thee, the bloody shirt I rang for thee, and wilt thou no waken and turn to me? Next day she kent know what to do for grief. She then brak the pear, and found it filled with jewellery far richer than the contents of the apple. With thy jewels she bargained for permission to be a second night in the young knight's chamber. But the auld wife gied him neither slip and drink, and he again slept till morning. Night she kept sighing and singing as before. 7 lang years I served for thee, etc. Still he sleeped, and she nearly lost hope of the gither. But that day, when he was out at the hunting, somebody asked him what noise and moaning was yon they heard all last night in his bedchamber. He said he heard no ony noise, but they assured him there was sae, and he resolved to keep waking that night to try what he could hear. That being the 3rd night, and the damosel being between hope and despair, she brake her plum, and it held far the richest jewellery of the 3. She bargained as before, and the old wife, as before, took in the sleeping drink to the young knight's chamber. But he told her he couldn't drink it that night without sweetening, and when she gaed away for some money to sweeten it wi', he poured out the drink, and sae made the old wife think he had drunk it. They all went to bed again, and the damosel began as before, singing, 7 lang years I served for thee, the glassy hill I clamb for thee, the bloody shirt I rang for thee, and will thou not waken and turn to me? He heard and turned to her, and she told him that had befallen her, and he told her that had happened to him. And he caused the old washerwife and her dochter to be burned, and they were married, and he and she are. The history of Jack the Giant Killer. In the reign of the famous King Arthur, there lived in Cornwall a lad named Jack, who was a boy of a bold temper, and took delight in hearing or reading of conjurers, giants, and fairies, and used to listen eagerly to the deeds of the knights of King Arthur's Round Table. In those days there lived on St. Michael's Mount off Cornwall a huge giant, 18 feet high and 9 feet round. His fierce and savage looks were the terror of all who beheld him. He dwelt in a gloomy cavern on top of the mountain, and used to wade over to the mainland in search of prey, where he would throw 6 oxen upon his back, and tie 3 times as many sheep and hogs round his waist, and march back to his own abode. The giant had done this for many years, when Jack resolved to destroy him. Jack took a horn, a shovel, a pickaxe, his armor, and a dark lantern, and one winter's evening he went to the mount. There he dug a pit 22 feet deep and 20 broad. He covered the top over so as to make it look like solid ground. He then blew his horn so loudly that the giant awoke and came out of his den, crying out, "You saucy villain, you shall pay for this. I'll broil you for my breakfast." He had just finished when, taking one step further, he tumbled headlong into the pit, and Jack struck him a blow on the head with his pickaxe, which killed him. Jack then returned home to cheer his friends with the news. Another giant, called Blunderbore, vowed to be revenged on Jack if ever he should have him in his power. This giant kept an enchanted castle in the midst of a lonely wood, and some time after the death of Cormoran, Jack was passing through a wood, and being weary, sat down and went to sleep. The giant, passing by and seeing Jack, carried him to his castle, where he locked him up in a large room, the floor of which was covered with the bodies, skulls, and bones of men and women. Soon after, the giant went to fetch his brother, who was likewise a giant, to take a meal off his flesh, and Jack saw with terror through the bars of his prison the two giants approaching. Jack, perceiving in one corner of the room a strong cord, took courage, and making a slip knot at each end, he threw them over their heads and tied it to the window bars. He then pulled till he had choked them. When they were black in the face, he slid down the rope and stabbed them to the heart. Next, Jack took a great bunch of keys from the pocket of Blunderbore and went into the castle again. He made a strict search through all the rooms, and in one of them found 3 ladies tied up by the hair of their heads and almost starved to death. They told him that their husbands had been killed by the giant, who had then condemned them to be starved to death because they would not eat the flesh of their own dead husbands. "Ladies," said Jack, "I have put an end to this monster and his wicked brother, and I give you this castle and all the riches it contains to make some amends for the dreadful pains you have felt." He then very politely gave them the keys of the castle and went further on his journey to Wales. As Jack had but little money, he went on as fast as possible. At length he came to a handsome house. Jack knocked at the door, when there came forth a Welsh giant. Jack said he was a traveller who had lost his way, on which the giant made him welcome, and led him into a room where there was a good bed to sleep in. Jack took off his clothes quickly, but though he was weary, he could not go to sleep. Soon after this he heard the giant walking backward and forward in the next room, and saying to himself, "Though here you lodge with me this night, you shall not see the morning light. My club shall dash your brains out quite." "Say you so?" thought Jack. "Are these your tricks upon travellers? But I hope to prove as cunning as you are." Then getting out of bed, he groped about the room, and at last found a thick, large billet of wood. He laid it in his own place in the bed, and then hid himself in a dark corner of the room. The giant, about midnight, entered the apartment, and with his bludgeon struck many blows on the bed in the very place where Jack had laid the log, and then he went back to his own room, thinking he had broken all Jack's bones. Early in the morning, Jack put a bold face upon the matter, and walked into the giant's room to thank him for his lodging. The giant started when he saw him, and began to stammer out, "Oh, dear me, is it you? Pray, how did you sleep last night? Did you hear or see anything in the dead of the night?" "Nothing to speak of," said Jack carelessly. "A rat, I believe, gave me 3 or 4 slaps with its tail, and disturbed me a little, but I soon went to sleep again." The giant wondered more and more at this, yet he did not answer a word, but went to bring 2 great bowls of hasty pudding for their breakfast. Jack wanted to make the giant believe that he could eat as much as himself, so he contrived to button a leathern bag inside his coat, and slipped the hasty pudding into the bag while he seemed to put it into his mouth. When breakfast was over, he said to the giant, "Now I will show you a fine trick. I can cure all wounds with a touch. I could cut off my head in 1 minute, and the next put it sound again on my shoulders. You shall see an example." He then took hold of the knife, ripped up the leathern bag, and all the hasty pudding tumbled out upon the floor. "Od splutter her nails!" cried the Welsh giant, who was ashamed to be outdone by such a little fellow as Jack. "Her can do that herself." So he snatched up the knife, plunged it into his own stomach, and in a moment dropped down dead. Jack, having hitherto been successful in all his undertakings, resolved not to be idle in future. He therefore furnished himself with a horse, a cap of knowledge, a sword of sharpness, shoes of swiftness, and an invisible coat, the better to perform the wonderful enterprises that lay before him. He travelled over high hills, and on the 3rd day he came to a large and spacious forest through which his road lay. Scarcely had he entered the forest when he beheld a monstrous giant dragging along by the hair of their heads a handsome knight and his lady. Jack alighted from his horse, and tying him to an oak tree, put on his invisible coat under which he carried his sword of sharpness. When he came up to the giant, he made several strokes at him, but could not reach his body, but wounded his thighs in several places, and at length, putting both hands to his sword and aiming with all his might, he cut off both his legs. Then Jack, setting his foot upon his neck, plunged his sword into the giant's body, when the monster gave a groan and expired. The knight and his lady thanked Jack for their deliverance, and invited him to their house to receive a proper reward for his services. "No," said Jack, "I cannot be easy till I find out this monster's habitation." So taking the knight's directions, he mounted his horse, and soon after came in sight of another giant, who was sitting on a block of timber waiting for his brother's return. Jack alighted from his horse, and putting on his invisible coat, approached and aimed a blow at the giant's head, but, missing his aim, he only cut off his nose. On this the giant seized his club and laid about him most unmercifully. "Nay," said Jack, "if this be the case, I'd better dispatch you." So jumping upon the block, he stabbed him in the back, whence he dropped down dead. Jack then proceeded on his journey, and travelled over hills and dales, till, arriving at the foot of a high mountain, he knocked at the door of a lonely house, when an old man let him in. When Jack was seated, the hermit thus addressed him: "My son, on the top of this mountain is an enchanted castle kept by the giant Galligantus and a vile magician. I lament the fate of a duke's daughter, whom they seized as she was walking in her father's garden, and brought hither transformed into a deer." Jack promised that in the morning, at the risk of his life, he would break the enchantment, and after a sound sleep he rose early, put on his invisible coat, and got ready for the attempt. When he had climbed to the top of the mountain, he saw 2 fiery griffins, but he passed between them without the least fear of danger, for they could not see him because of his invisible coat. On the castle gate he found a golden trumpet, under which were written these lines: "Whoever can this trumpet blow shall cause the giant's overthrow." As soon as Jack had read this, he seized the trumpet and blew a shrill blast which made the gates fly open and the very castle itself tremble. The giant and the conjurer now knew that their wicked course was at an end, and they stood biting their thumbs and shaking with fear. Jack, with his sword of sharpness, soon killed the giant, and the magician was then carried away by a whirlwind, and every knight and beautiful lady who had been changed into birds and beasts returned to their proper shapes. The castle vanished away like smoke, and the head of the giant Galligantus was then sent to King Arthur. The knights and ladies rested that night at the old man's hermitage, and next day they set out for the court. Jack then went up to the king and gave his majesty an account of all his fierce battles. Jack's fame had now spread through the whole country, and at the king's desire the duke gave him his daughter in marriage, to the joy of all his kingdom. After this, the king gave him a large estate, on which he and his lady lived the rest of their days.